Hello, fellow griever. Welcome to the Leftover Pieces podcast, where I talk honestly about suicide loss, grief, and learning to live forward after the loss. I'm Melissa, your host. Hello, and welcome back, fellow griever. Today, I am sharing my conversation that I had recently with Colleen Kraft, a pediatrician of 36 years, a mother of 3, and a woman whose life changed forever in February of 2022 when her son Tim died by suicide at the age of 31. Tim's story is one that holds so many layers. He was vibrant, funny, creative, a young man who had built a life for himself. And then, in his late 20s, everything began to shift. What initially appeared as changes in behavior eventually revealed itself as early psychosis and later a diagnosis of schizophrenia. In this conversation, Colleen brings both sides of herself into the room, the mother and the physician. And what unfolds is an honest, deeply informative, and incredibly human look at what it's like to love someone through serious mental illness and what it's like to lose them. We talk about the realities of the mental health system, the gaps, the frustrations, the lack of continuity of care that so many families experience. We talk about psychosis, what it actually is and why it can lead to dangerous or risky behavior, and why understanding it matters more than most people realize. We also talk about something that many of us carry after loss, the questions, the what ifs, the wondering about those final moments and whether something could have been different. And then we move into what comes after, the grief, the guilt, the attempt to make sense of something that doesn't make sense. And ultimately, we began to hold both love and loss in the same space. This is a conversation that is both educational and deeply personal. It is one that may help you better understand what someone you love is going through, or help you feel less alone if you've lived this yourself. So I hope you'll stay with us. Welcome. Hi, Colleen, and welcome to the podcast. I am so honored to have you on.
Well, thank you so much. I'm so honored to be a guest on your podcast.
I know everybody heard a little bit about what brought you here, which is always that duality for me, that double-edged sword of being so honored that you're here and willing to share all this and wishing you didn't need to be. So I'm going to start by asking you to share with us a little bit about your story and Tim's loss and Tim's life.
Well, thank you so much. So I am a pediatrician. I have 3 children. My youngest son, Tim, was always a young person full of life. He was always very funny, stood out, was kind of the class clown and the life of the party. Growing up, had problems with learning disabilities and a little bit of problems with attention deficit disorder, but did well going through school. And as a young adult, was actually very successful in some of the different things that he did. He eventually settled in New York City and got his real estate license and was a wonderful chef and worked as a sous chef. I have a picture of him when he was 25 years old shaking Michael Bloomberg's hand at a meeting in Abu Dhabi, and they were discussing real estate in New York City. And as you know, when your children are successful in their mid-20s, the last thing they want is a parent who is asking about them every day and on their back. And so you let them live and be young adults. And what I didn't know was that he was in some of the early stages of psychosis. And when he was 28, I got a call from my other son who told me that he was walking around and was fearful about things and was hiding knives different places, and people were afraid of him. And so I went back to Virginia from California, and indeed, he was not in his right mind at all. We went to the hospital, and he was actually committed. In California, we call it a 5150 and maybe called a TDO other places. But he went into the hospital with a psychotic break. And that first hospitalization was really traumatic for everybody because nobody will let you know what's happening with your child. You know that they're not in their right mind. You know that they're suffering, but I couldn't get a psychiatrist to talk to me. I couldn't get staff to talk to me. I was able to go and see him one time, and they took my cell phone, and that was actually when the psychiatrist tried to call me. So the amount of information you get when you're involved with a child is really next to nothing. But he eventually got out after 72 hours and really was not able to work and came back out to California with me. So we started with psychiatric treatment. What happens is that if you need psychiatric treatment and you want it in a timely fashion, you wind up paying out of pocket for it. And it's very expensive, but we had to do that. He needed it. And initially, he did really well. He was with a psychiatrist and a therapist, and he did well enough that he got a job working in a t-shirt office and factory. He wanted his own apartment, and so we put him up in his own apartment. He had friends. He was playing pool. He was doing jujitsu and was taking some art classes. And we found that the art was really important for him therapeutically. He was a brilliant painter and could paint everything from landscapes to the landscape inside of his mind when his mind was really going downward and he was having psychotic thoughts. And I have his paintings now, and I look at them because they tell the story of his illness, and they tell the story of his calm and his talent. Anyway, he was well for about 6 to 7 months. And then he started getting worse again with really no explanation. He was taking his medication. He was going to therapy. And what I found was that he wasn't answering calls and texts. Some of his friends said he wasn't coming out with them when they wanted to go out. And when I go to his apartment, I would find him just sitting on his phone or sometimes painting. I would find that he hadn't eaten for days, that he hadn't taken a shower for days. And before he got sick, this was a kid that took a shower 2 or 3 times a day because he wanted to look good. He wanted to be presentable. So to have him really start to go downward with his hygiene was really something that was not him. And what we found out was that he was not doing better. We went back to the psychiatrist and said, he's getting worse. And they had no explanation for us. They told us, if he has to go to the hospital, then you need to take him to the hospital. But there's no connection between the psychiatrist as an outpatient or the psychiatrist as an inpatient. There's no continuity of care. There's no follow-up. Now, as a physician, I know that this is not right. So when I have a child that I see who has pneumonia and needs to be in the hospital because they're having trouble breathing or they're dehydrated, I call my colleagues in the hospital. They go into the hospital. And as soon as that child is discharged, that child comes back to see me. That doesn't happen in the mental health system at all. If you're hospitalized with a psychiatric emergency or a crisis, you leave the hospital and there's nothing. There's no one. There's no follow-up. So eventually I did some research and looked up and found a trial at UCLA. It was a clinical trial, and he seemed to be eligible for it. It was really looking at people who had early psychosis syndrome, and he was less than 2 years out from having his initial psychotic break. And so I took him and he was interviewed and he was accepted into the clinical trial. And interestingly, this was the first place where he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. So he was being treated for 1.5 years by psychiatrists and therapists, and nobody made that diagnosis. Well, I understand why. It's a horrible diagnosis, and nobody really wants to make that diagnosis because the outcomes are pretty poor. And it's scary, it's neurodegenerative and frightening. Well, Tim really worked in that clinical trial. He had weekly psychiatry, twice a week therapy, exercise, neurocognitive training. At one point, he was on an injected antipsychotic, which helped a lot with the psychosis. It didn't help entirely. He still had psychosis, but it really decreased it. But it made him tired and lethargic and depressed. And he gained 50 pounds. Really horrible side effects. But despite that, he would get up to go to his therapy, to go to his appointments, to do what he needed to do to try to get better. And I really applauded his effort because it took a lot with both the disease and the side effects of the treatment to really be engaged in it. But he did. But it was tough because this was during the pandemic. A lot of his therapy was virtual. A lot of his groups and sessions were virtual. And what happens with psychosis spectrum disorders like schizophrenia is that your behavior really turns off your friends, your relatives, people that you cared about don't want to associate with you anymore. And then with the pandemic on top of that, he really felt very, very isolated. His art was still important to him as therapy. And it was really amazing to see what he could do with his art and how it really helped to calm him and what he produced during this time when he was fighting schizophrenia so hard. There were a couple of times when we talked about whether he needed to be hospitalized or not, when he would have psychotic episodes. And even with this UCLA clinical trial, the psychiatrist told me, well, if he has to be hospitalized, he can't come here because he's on public insurance. And so he would have to go to another hospital. I mean, that, as a doctor, that is just so highly unethical. But that's the way it was. Well, eventually, Tim finished up with the clinical trial, and he was somewhat stabilized. He had some improvements. By January of 2022, he actually got a haircut, cleaned himself off, had a girlfriend, was beginning to take some online courses, was beginning to play guitar again, and was painting. And I had a little bit of a sigh of relief because I felt like he was getting acclimated to who his new person was. And on February 26th, I woke up. I had a conference to go to that day, and we had coffee together, and I went to my conference. And we often would go down to Orange County on Saturdays and see some friends. Well, I called him and asked him if he wanted to go. And he said, no, stay there. I'm okay. I just need to think through some things, and I'll see you tomorrow night. And that night, what I found out was he bought a ghost gun online and drove out north of Los Angeles and ended it. And what I'll never know is whether this happened purposefully or did this happen as a result of psychosis. When I heard from the policeman who called me about Tim, when they found Tim, and I realized that he had died by suicide, the first thing that came to my mind was really the ancient Hawaiian Ho'oponopono reconciliation, which is, I love you. Thank you. I forgive you. Please forgive me. I told him I knew how hard he struggled and how he fought to get better and how he was rejected by so many people and that he gave it his all. And it's okay to go. Go see your grandparents. Go be with some of your friends who went before you. And I understand, and I will miss you forever.
Colleen, thank you for sharing all of that. It doesn't matter whether it's been 2 years or 20 years, the story's always hard. And it's always hard to listen to. I appreciate your vulnerability in being here and sharing all of that. There was so much in listening to you talk about Tim that made me smile about who he was. It made my heart sad and heavy because I do see a lot of parallels in the way I hear a lot of our stories go. I know that Alex didn't have, to my knowledge, any psychosis at the time, but to even hear you at the end talk about the upswing that he experienced and the relief that you were having, I felt that way. And so for you to have that wisdom of obviously something you had learned before from the Ho'oponopono reconciliation prayer was so powerful for you in the beginning, wasn't it? As far as starting on this journey, which splits your life open, but then it's how we face that, how we learn to stand up. So I would like you to talk a little bit now about the aftermath. You call it the summer of obliteration, but despite the fact that you were trying to send him love and understanding, you still had a broken heart.
Absolutely. You're still obliterated.
Mm-hmm.
And what I wound up going back to and what I had to really work on healing for myself was the night that it all happened. Did I miss something? I often asked myself, should I have gone back anyway, even when he told me not to? And this, in fact, is really some of the horror of what happens to parents who have a child with serious persistent mental health disorders. You live on the edge. You're hypervigilant. You're always in fear of them hurting themselves or hurting somebody else or hurting you. And you make the decisions with the data that you have in front of you. But in the background is always that sense that something awful could happen. They could go into psychosis. They could do something that they wouldn't do if their mind was in the right place. But they have a disease where their mind is degenerating. And that is really something that over that first summer I had to come to terms with. And counseling, getting involved in some group, listening to your podcast, all of that was very, very helpful for me to start to accept that. And acceptance isn't putting it away. Acceptance is really engaging with some of that grief and some of that sorrow. And acceptance is taking your own insight and perspective and developing some wisdom with this. And this is what gets us later on to share and to find meaning in this and share with others who are going down that same journey, which is not rare. 1% of all Americans have been diagnosed with schizophrenia or suspected of having schizophrenia.
And what you said about mental health professionals truly kind of stepping back a minute before they give that diagnosis often, because it is a lifetime thing that you're putting out there. That's a really heavy diagnosis. And, I told you that it mirrors the 1.1 or 1%, the one in about every 100 people worldwide that die by suicide. So of every 100 deaths, one of those is suicide. And so to realize the same amount of the population that's dying by suicide is the same amount that also is walking around with a schizophrenic disorder puts that in a perspective of realizing how many people, and that's just schizophrenia. That doesn't touch all of the other mental health disorders that have a preponderance to have a greater ending in suicide. There's a decent amount of them out there. And where if you have these illnesses or these diagnoses, your chance of dying by suicide is higher. And I think you told me out of that 1%, 5 to 15% tend to end their life.
That is correct. So if you're diagnosed with schizophrenia, the incidence of suicide is anywhere in the literature between 5 and 15% of people with schizophrenia dying by suicide. So it's very high.
Yeah.
Interestingly, there is a subset of people who are at much higher risk of dying by suicide. And as I looked at that list, I could have checked all the boxes for Tim. It is males, single, white, no immediate family, males who had premorbid good function. So the kid at 25 who was shaking Michael Bloomberg's hand, and then the kid at 30 who had to be in a clinical trial for schizophrenia, were very, very different people. And there are times when they remember that 25-year-old, and you could see where the hopelessness would come from there.
I want to lean in a little bit to the fact that you are a pediatrician and in your field where you live and work. If you would speak to the longevity throughout your career as a pediatrician, have you noticed the difference in what's occurring in the mental health of our youth? Do you feel like you could speak to what you've seen in the last decade-ish? The uptick in youth suicide started around 2008 or 9, but it really took an uptick around 2014. So 2014 is where we really started to see the surge of these young people, even as young as 11, 12, 13, dying by suicide. And now we're hearing it so regularly. So can you speak to that as we transition to your mother, doctor, and back and forth piece?
Sure. So I've been a pediatrician for 36 years. And early on in practice, you didn't hear much about suicide. And in my own mind, I wonder how much of that was because of the isolation and the shame from families, and how much of it was this is just something we weren't talking about, or what was really occurring with our kids and our adolescents. But certainly as time went on, we saw less of the really horrible infectious diseases that are vaccine preventable, and more mental health and developmental disabilities. And really to that point, in the early 2000s, I was very interested in finding out more about how you diagnose, treat kids that have developmental and behavioral pediatrics disorders, because we were seeing more and more kids with depression, with anxiety, with autism, with other disabilities that were, prior to that, really not talked about and not treated. So I actually worked with a psychiatrist to learn about some of the mental health therapies as well as some of the medications. And really, since the mid-2000s, have prescribed some of these medications that I talked to you about with Tim that cause some of these horrible side effects. But for some kids, they really are life-saving. Once we got into the late 2000 teens, there was a big emphasis at the American Academy of Pediatrics on screening for depression, screening for anxiety, having screening tools in your office, screening for suicide. So a lot of my colleagues use something called the ASQ, which really looks for suicidal thoughts in people. And you screen. The whole idea that we tell parents is that we screen because we want to know if there's something there that your child is thinking about, because we don't want things to be a surprise. If there's a problem, we want to catch it early. So there's a big push on looking at this, and I think it's great. I think, though, that you will find more people saying yes because you're screening for it. Do I think it increased anyway? Yeah, I think it did. And I think that there is a role of things like social media where people can be very anonymous and very ugly to each other, to even some of the neuroscience where we're looking at social media and looking at how the pathways in the brain are going from your pleasure pathways to some of your caution pathways, and how likes and emojis and things will make you want to look at something that your frontal lobe says caution, but you become more interested in because of the way that this all works. So the neuroscience behind why we have more anxiety and depression in teenagers is fascinating, but it gives us some clues on what we can do to help normalize this for kids, to get them back to the place where they're active and happier and not so worried about things that they can't control.
And it has to do with reframing things, but there is ways to retrain our neural pathways in our brain after loss, after grief, after trauma, in order to get out of these degrading loops that we get into. So to hear you saying that, it was the first time it clicked in this way of me saying, the same thing is happening in reverse with young people, especially. It speaks to what's happening. There is some rewiring of brains going on, and not for the better.
You're absolutely right. And when it comes to teenagers, there are three things that I talk to my teenagers about because of the point you made about the brain developing. We know that the frontal lobe is not entirely set until your mid-20s. So we have developing nerve connections, developing nerve synapses, and in the brain itself, that is both structure, it's neurotransmitters, and it's wiring. And there are three things that we are finding really disrupt the developing brain. One is marijuana. A lot of places are legalizing marijuana. We are telling the teens stay away from it because it will disrupt your developing brain, particularly overuse of marijuana. Number two is nicotine. We know that kids who are starting to smoke or to vape early on develop much more of a dependence on nicotine. And it becomes a lifelong habit that they have a lot of trouble getting rid of. And then the third thing is alcohol. So when I talk to my teens and they tell me, well, my aunt, uncle smokes pot and it really helps them, or they have a glass of wine at nighttime and it really helps them. The difference is exactly what you talked about with the developing brain and the risk of rewiring. Because if you use marijuana, if you use alcohol, if you use nicotine, and you are a teenager, your brain will be rewired differently.
And that's scary because youth is fraught with experimentation, right? But then we can look back at youth for generations and say that they drink, they have smoked pot, and it had an effect, I'm sure. And they didn't have the world that we have today with the technology and everything. So you add all these things together, and we've created a perfect storm of the worst scenarios out there for many of our youth and just people in general.
And I think that we should note as well that there is a high co-occurring condition between schizophrenia and other mental health disorders, as well as addiction. And let's talk about addiction for a minute. What new therapy do we have for addiction that wasn't here 40 years ago?
Not much.
40 years ago, we had Just Say No. Okay, we still have that. 40 years ago, we were starting with medication administration training, things like methadone. We still have that. We have Suboxone, which does a little bit better job, but nothing more. 40 years ago, we had Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous. We still have that. But if addiction is just as big a problem and bigger for our teenagers who are maybe trying to self-medicate if they're having trouble, where's the research and where is the new treatments for this? As a doctor, I will make the analogy with childhood cancer. Childhood cancer has come such a long way in the last 40 years. We have CAR T cells, we have different antibodies. You can't turn on the TV anymore and not hear about the latest monoclonal that will help your psoriatic arthritis or have you live longer with cancer. We don't have that in mental health. We certainly don't have that with addiction. Right. We certainly don't have that with serious persistent mental illness like schizophrenia. Mm-hmm. And so what we do have for our teenagers is really that just say no warning. And the evidence now that substance use is only going to make anything else worse.
Many people self-medicate, but there's a loop that many people don't realize. Alcohol caused depression versus there are many people that have depression and they're self-medicating. They may have anxiety and they're leaning on it. It becomes a loop that they get stuck in because they're dependent on it. But in reality, the addiction could be the problem to start with. The substance could be the problem to start with.
So very interesting, because often what happens, and really is prodromal to a diagnosis of something like schizophrenia, is that parents notice the substance use and they take their children in for treatment for the substance use. And it is not until later on that it's noticed that there is actually a serious persistent mental illness. So that's why it's important to understand that these are co-occurring conditions. If you have one, you definitely have to make sure you don't have the other. And if you do, look at treatment for both. I think it's really important for people to know why psychosis leads to risky or dangerous behavior. And psychosis is really best described as a break from reality. It happens for a number of reasons. In a condition like schizophrenia, you have accelerated brain aging. You have structural problems like reduced gray matter in your brain and reduced white matter integrity. You have problems with neurochemical imbalances. One of the big imbalances, and one that most of the medications help to treat, is dopamine. But if you think about dopamine, dopamine is one of your happy hormones. And so if your treatment is going to decrease the amount of dopamine that's in your brain, that's not going to make you want to stay on treatment. There are now some new medications that focus on muscarinic receptors and serotonin, and hopefully these will give us some new treatments for schizophrenia. But there's actual brain changes, physical changes with schizophrenia. When you have a brain change, a neurochemical change, or something else that sets off psychosis, it becomes a network level disruption. So when somebody is in psychosis, they have hallucinations and delusions, so distorted perceptions. They have impaired judgment and reality testing. They have emotional dysregulation. So the amygdala, which is part of the brain that regulates your emotions, becomes hyperactive. Their thinking is disorganized, and then they have overactivity of their dopamine. When you're in psychosis, and then if you're in psychosis and you're using a substance, that brings this from being something that is bothering that individual to making that individual dangerous to himself, herself, others, or even their parents or people who are loved. And so many of the parents I've talked with who've had children with schizophrenia live in that fear because psychosis is a very unstable part. In psychosis, your child might think that you are somebody dangerous who needs to be removed. They may think that somebody that they see on the street or a friend of theirs is dangerous or is out to get them, and bad things can happen then. And I think it's important for us to understand that whole dynamic, because this is very much why awful things happen when people are in psychosis. And then when they're out of psychosis, they often will be interviewed and realized, you mean I did that to somebody? And sometimes they do that to themselves. I always wondered if this was something that happened with Tim. He had a psychotic thought and ended it. We'll never know, but we know that schizophrenia can set off all of these actions, and that it's important for all of us to know that when somebody in schizophrenia is in psychosis, that they are unstable, and that really should be that medical emergency.
To have a psychotic break and be in psychosis, that doesn't just happen with schizophrenia, right? It can happen with other mental health disorders.
It can absolutely happen with other mental health disorders. And what we're learning through basic research is the mechanism of how that psychosis happens is going to be different. So somebody who has bipolar disorder, it will happen generally as their brain is going into what's called mania. So it happens then. It can happen because of just substance abuse. I mean, substance use can set off psychosis. But psychosis becomes that part of being in that illness that is the most dangerous, where they're going to be the most dangerous to themselves or other people.
Let's talk a little bit about treatment realities.
Okay. Well, I think that even in the news, we've heard some recent tragedies that remind us that when somebody who has serious mental illness experiences a crisis, that it's not just them. It's not just one event. It's a predictable result of decades of policy choices that underfund basic research, treatment, support systems. We know that early diagnosis and intervention, having accessible medication and therapy, having stable supportive housing, having crisis response teams that really listen to families, because many of my families have told me that the crisis support team came and their child seemed to be acting fine, and so they left them there, even though they knew they were in psychosis and dangerous. Having peer support and then having care coordination, all of those things are really going to be very, very important. And there are some models in other places in the world.
Discuss Norway for a minute.
So Norway now has centers where there's, first of all, early intervention. And that early intervention for somebody with a psychotic break or has psychosis spectrum disorder looks like this. A lot of it is education. It is knowing this is your disease. This is something we don't have a cure for, but we have a lot of treatments for it. And the first thing that we have to work with you on is recognizing when you are losing control and psychosis is happening. There is a thing that's called anosognosia that people with schizophrenia have, and that term means that they don't recognize what's going on. They don't believe that there's anything wrong with them. And that's a real problem with this disease, because if you don't think there's anything wrong with you, you're not going to get treatment. But a lot of the early intervention is teaching about that. And, it's like if you have diabetes, you know that if you eat sugary things and you don't take care of your diet, that you're going to make your condition worse. It's very much like that. It's knowing that this is a part of your condition, that there are going to be times when you don't think you're sick. But if we can come to a center, talk to somebody, rather than give you an injection of something or put you in a hospital, and that we have your permission that if you are in a state where you're going into psychosis, that we can use medication, that this is a place where you can stay. That's not a hospital. But if you need to go to a hospital, we have a connection there. And when you're better, you can come back to this center to have us talk with you and work with you through your illness. That would be absolutely wonderful. Most of the places in Norway actually don't even use medication. They're able to use more talk therapy because they are educating patients on where their disease is, what happens when they start to go into psychosis and how dangerous that is, and what are the tools we can use to get out of it. And in the meantime, let's find some supportive housing. Let's find a job that you might want to do. Work is something that's really important to all of us because we need to have a purpose. And people with psychotic spectrum disorders need to have a purpose, just like that. So work is important.
I'm guessing there's a public component to the education piece of that, of educating the public a little bit more on mental health as a whole. In other words, it's destigmatizing mental health a little bit more.
I think that's a very important part, and I don't know specifically if that is part of it. You can start with families. It's important to be able to talk about destigmatization with families, because families are the ones that are living in fear, and they're living in a lot of guilt. Did I do something to cause this? If I don't do this right, will something bad happen? And so you can start with families, with teaching what goes on with this illness, with knowing that when your child doesn't want to believe that they are sick, but they are sick, that is a medical emergency. We have options other than just putting them into the hospital for 3 days and then coming home to nothing. That is there.
And I want you to talk about what you think the public gets wrong.
It is not our job to play Monday morning quarterback when tragedies happen. It's our job to learn from them. Let's learn about the disease. Let's learn about the best ways to take care of it. Let's learn about what happens when things are getting worse so that we as a collective group know how to best care for people and how to tap someone on the shoulder and say, I'm here to help you out. I think that your brain is going into psychosis. It's really important to put our money where our mouths are and to advocate for funding some basic research and other clinical trials. There's a great clinical trial network called EpiNet that is looking at early psychosis and really focusing on even younger adolescents who may be developing psychosis. And they are looking at developing these models of treatment that are not going to the hospital and then leave, really looking at what happens and what can we do to care for these people during this time. But there are some amazing other groups, too, that are very, very helpful. There's the Schizophrenia and Psychosis Action Alliance network, which has a website, a Facebook page. They are terrific in terms of having the family support, having that family connection, teaching some of these really basic things about psychosis and what it does, and teaching how you can identify when you're having trouble, where you need to go, how and why to stay away from things like marijuana, alcohol, nicotine. And there's even some podcasts. There's one that I listen to that's called Schizophrenia, Three Moms in the Trenches. And these are three very accomplished women. One of them is actually a legislator in Minnesota. And they talk about their journeys with their sons. And these journeys are hospitalizations, medication or no medication, sometimes violence, sometimes jail. And you learn that your anticipatory grief, the grief that you have because your child is not the child that you always wanted and tried to put together, that your fear, that your horror, that all of the things that you worry about that keep you hypervigilant are really part of a greater community, and identify a greater need, but become that support as well, too, where you can figure out what you need to do, how you really develop acceptance, which is that insight and that perspective and that wisdom to make things better for everyone.
Well put, ma'am. So as we think about closing our conversation out a little bit, I want to do a couple of things. I want to be sure you have mentioned everything that you feel you want to talk about, whether it be around the medical side of things or the mother side of things. Either way, equally important. I would actually say the mother role is more important. I'm sure you would agree.
I do.
And that, we don't say that lightly to somebody who's highly educated and in a professional field, but I know how important motherhood is. So I know we all say, yep, that's my first role. That's my one that I care about when I'm gone that people talk about. But so we want to talk about the love mattering and the effort mattering, and that parents, we feel like a failure so much after our child dies by suicide. And so we want to address how we can hold truth and compassion for people at the same time. Like, that's so important. And I want to be sure we touch on the hope of continuing this relationship with our child after death, once we are in this position to no longer be in the prevention space. We're now in this surviving this space. And that doesn't mean those two can't work together. Hopefully they can, to prevent future people from joining this most horrible space that you and I occupy. But both of them exist for you, right? There is some level of wanting to be preventative, and you're still a survivor who's wanting to offer hope to those of us that have also lost someone to suicide. So what say you to all of that?
One of my favorite resources during my time out of obliteration was the book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow by Frances Wells. And the whole concept that as we grow into acceptance, we learn how to hold gratitude in one hand and grief in another, and stretch ourselves larger between them, to me is so important, and speaks to exactly what you've had to say, that you're always going to miss them, but you develop a different relationship with them and think about them all the time. You have your ritual, you have your times of sadness, and that's okay. And you have your times of joy and laughing and remembering something funny that they said or did. And that is life after loss. That is how we hold gratitude in one hand, grief in another, and then doing things like this podcast, like being a shoulder for a friend who's going through this. This is how we stretch ourselves larger between the gratitude and grief.
I love that you brought up Frances Weller. We did a unit last year in a mother's loss mastermind group that I have, and we used that book and read all the way through it and worked through it in a mom's loss group that I led. It's just full of wisdom. It is so wonderful. It's an amazing body of work, and he's an amazing therapist. And I know that's who Anderson Cooper's talked about him some as well, because he's worked with him. And if anybody's listening and wants to know if that book's worth it, 100%. That's a great book. I will put this in the show notes. I'll put a link to it because it's really good. And if anybody leads groups like I do, it does have a companion that helps them go through. And it's so helpful. The more we know, the better we do. And that doesn't just mean for others, the better we do for ourselves.
That's absolutely right. Grief is something that we all experience. We don't have to do it by ourselves. And healing is something we can all experience. We have to make a choice to do it. But in community, it makes it so much more possible. And it's just so important.
It is the single most important thing to finding yourself in a place of being more at peace with your journey. We can learn to live a joyful life afterwards, and we can learn to embrace these things in different ways. Thank you for bringing parts of your amazing son into this conversation. I've had the privilege of getting to know him a little bit too through the poem that you submitted to the anthology project.
Absolutely right. There's art, there's music, there's photography, and really what you've been doing with getting these works together and having them out in the public is just another way of telling the story. It's another way of sharing some of the wisdom and guidance for maybe somebody who may be suffering mental health problems now.
Exactly.
It may be preventive. It is definitely something that's healing. That's so important.
That's why it's a great connector, right? They say a picture's worth 1,000 words, and people feel connected to songs when they don't know how else to express themselves. So I'm not going to be producing an album, y'all, but I will keep putting out bodies of work. And I'd love to do things like include, because there's several moms in my community that I know had artist children, and we could highlight like a center section of beautiful art or something. That would be a great way to honor our kids and gently create the awareness out there. It helps destigmatize when you realize how amazing and beautiful and creative and compassionate these people were, our kids, our loved ones.
And it becomes their gift to the world too.
It does.
You know, if they could leave us with something, this is what they would leave us with beauty and with emotion and with music and with art. And in that way, they move it forward. They might not have been able to get over something that was horrible going on with their brain, but maybe they'll affect the next person. So let's let them do that.
Anything else you want to leave us with before we close? This has just been a gift.
I just thank you for the opportunity to come onto the podcast and talk about Tim.
You're so welcome. I appreciate you so much, Colleen. Thank you. Have a good day. So thank you for being here today. If something in this episode resonated with you, please feel free to share it with someone who might need it too. For resources, coaching, or ways to work with me, visit theleftoverpieces.com. And for now, take what serves you and leave the rest. Talk soon.